Today's video is on the scientists and their theories on where life began. There are two main theories. Spontaneous generation is the theory that states living things can come from non-living things. This is an idea that was based on observation over thousands of years, and what people had noticed was that after a rain, there were worms on the ground. So they concluded that the worms came from the rain. Spontaneous generation, worms came from the rain. And there are various examples of this. When they would open a bag of grain, there were mice in it. So they assumed that the mice spontaneously generated from the grain. And various other examples that we'll hopefully look at a couple of them. Biogenesis is a theory that we go with today, and it's the theory that states life comes from other living things. Francesco Redi was the first scientist to put this theory, spontaneous generation theory, and disprove it. He took jars of meat and placed them in various types of containers. The first container was an open jar where flies could go in and land. The second type of jar was a solid lid. Flies and air could not penetrate back and forth. And the third type of jar had a cloth over it, kind of like a net, so that air was able to transfer back and forth, but flies and other organisms could not land directly on the meat. And what he discovered was that the maggots that appeared only appeared in the rotting meat where the flies had been able to land. The second set of jars with a solid lid, flies could not land and no maggots appeared on the rotting meat. And in the third set of jars, the flies could not land on the meat, but they could land on the netting, and that smell drew them in. And the flies laid the maggots on the netting. So he disproved the theory that rotting meat spontaneously generated maggots, and that the actual maggots came from the flies. Then the flies landing on the meat laid the larval maggots. John Needham is the second scientist we're going to look at, and he took these flasks of broth and he heated them to a certain temperature, but there were some mistakes in his experimental design. He heated the flasks, but then he set them on the counter to cool, and after they cooled, he closed the opening to the flask. He let it sit for a while, and what he found was that the flask developed a real cloudy appearance, and that there was a lot of microorganisms growing in that broth. And so he stated that spontaneous generation did take place, but on the microscopic level with microorganisms. So he proved it through his theory that spontaneous generation did occur, although there were various flaws in his experiment. When he heated his broth, he didn't heat it to a high enough temperature to kill everything in the broth. And when he set it out on the counter, the air was able to penetrate into the broth, and microorganisms that were in the air were able to enter the broth and grow. So today we can look at John Needham's experiment and see that there were many problems with it. Lazzaro Spallanzani took the same experiment, but he changed it a bit. He heated the flasks to a higher temperature and for a longer amount of time, which the heating of the flasks and the broth killed the microorganisms that would have been in it. And then as soon as the heating was done, he sealed the flasks, so no air could penetrate between the two. And from his experiment, where he corrected the mistakes of the other scientist, he was able to disprove the theory that spontaneous generation occurred in microorganisms. Louis Pasteur. he took this to another level again. He took these flasks that look kind of funny, and they have this S neck, they call it. And he heated the flasks to a high degree, and then he let them cool on the counter. He did this with flasks with an S neck, and he did this with flasks and then removed the S neck and let them cool. What he found was that the flasks that had the S neck, even though they were open to the air at the tips of them, they did not grow microorganisms. But the ones that were open directly without the S neck did grow the microorganisms. And the idea with this was that the microorganisms that are in the air are attached to things like dust and maybe dirt particles. And when they entered the neck, they come in and they drop and they gather right here. They don't have enough momentum to travel the whole distance, to travel back up the S neck and down. That all of those microorganisms were trapped right here. So they couldn't enter the broth and grow because they couldn't travel around the top of the S neck and down. And that the ones that had no S neck, all the dust particles with the microorganisms had to do was drop in and grow. So his experiment disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. We have Alexander Oparin, and he took the idea and he created a hypothesis, and we call it Oparin's hypothesis. And it states that life began when energy from the sun, lightning, and the heat from the earth triggered chemical reactions early in Earth's history. Now, early in Earth's history, when it first formed, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. It was made of ammonia and methane, and it was a very, very hot place. There was lots of volcanic eruptions, and there was lots of meteors hitting, and lightning and violent storms. So he's stating that the sun, the lightning, the volcanic reaction, the heat from the earth, they all came together to form life. But there's one thing that's missing, and they're not really sure what that is. But all of these events came together and created the first cell. We call this the primordial soup. It's when newly formed molecules wash into the oceans. It became part of what's called primordial soup, and it's the water that was on Earth where the first life started to grow. Next we have Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. They took Oparin's hypothesis and they tested it. And they created this contraption, and they added the gas of what Earth's early atmosphere would have been like. So the methane, the ammonia, the water vapor, hydrogen, they added all the gas into the contraption. And within this contraption, they added electricity, like lightning. And when they were done and they ran everything through their machine, what they created, they never created life, but they created stuff that life needs. So they created this ocean-like liquid that contained amino acids. And amino acids are found in present-day cells. So what they concluded was that there's one other aspect of this experiment that they don't know. So there's something besides the sun, the electricity, and the atmosphere, the heat that came together. There's some maybe collision or something happened. This unknown something created life. They were very close in creating life. They created stuff that life needs, that's inside of life, but they didn't actually create life. that is the video for today. Thank you very much.